They did not ask for her name before they decided she was guilty. The announcement echoed faintly through the bustling international airport terminal in the early morning rush, where rolling suitcases and boarding calls mixed into a constant mechanical hum that never truly stopped. At gate C-18, a black woman stood calmly beside a security checkpoint line that had suddenly become a controlled perimeter. Her name was Olivia Carter, though no one in the immediate space seemed interested in learning it. She wore a simple, structured black coat over a white blouse, her posture upright, her expression controlled in a way that did not match the tension forming around her. A transportation security officer stepped forward, followed by Officer Daniel Reed, whose presence immediately shifted the tone of the area. He was confident in the way people become when procedure feels like authority and authority feels like certainty. "Ma'am, step aside from the line and place your luggage on the inspection table," he said, voice firm, already signaling that the situation had moved beyond routine screening. Olivia complied without protest, not because she was submissive, but because she was observant. Her eyes tracked everything: the spacing between officers, the hesitation in one junior agent's stance, the subtle delay in communication between terminals. Officer Reed opened her suitcase with practiced efficiency, but his movements slowed when he reached the second layer of clothing. A sealed folder had been flagged during a preliminary scan. "What is this?" he asked, holding it up without waiting for an answer. Olivia looked at the folder briefly. "Internal transfer documentation," she said simply. Reed exhaled through his nose, skeptical. Internal does not mean exempt from inspection. Around them, travelers slowed their pace, sensing escalation. The airport environment continued its rhythm, but this small section of space had shifted into something sharper, more focused. Another officer whispered something about a potential customs violation, and the phrase "smuggling suspicion" passed quietly between radios. Olivia did not react. She did not defend herself. She only observed how quickly assumptions were being built without verification. Reed gestured towards secondary screening. "You will come with us for further questioning." His tone suggested conclusion rather than inquiry. Olivia finally looked directly at him, not with anger, but with calm attention that made the moment feel heavier than it should have been. "On what basis?" she asked. Reed tightened his jaw. "Standard procedure based on flag materials." The words were final in his mind. Two officers stepped closer, not aggressively, but decisively, signaling compliance was expected. Olivia adjusted her coat slightly and picked up her bag without resistance. The movement was slow, deliberate, controlled. As she followed them, the surrounding travelers resumed motion, but the atmosphere around gate C-18 remained altered, as if the space itself understood that something had begun here that had not yet revealed its full structure. And Officer Daniel Reed believed, without hesitation, that he was in control of it. Inside the secure secondary screening corridor, the lighting shifted from bright terminal white to a colder institutional tone, where every surface reflected control rather than comfort. Olivia Carter walked a few steps ahead of Officer Daniel Reed and his team, her pace steady, neither rushed nor hesitant, as if the environment itself had no influence over her internal rhythm. The corridor was quieter than the main terminal, but the silence here was not peace. It was procedural expectation. Reed followed closely, glancing at the sealed folder that had triggered the escalation. "You said internal documentation," he repeated, his tone slightly sharper now, as if repetition might expose inconsistency. Olivia did not turn immediately. When she did, her expression remained unchanged. "That is correct," she said. One of the junior officers behind Reed leaned slightly forward, whispering that the system flag still had not cleared. Reed raised his hand, signaling them to proceed to the inspection room. As they entered, the door sealed with a soft electronic confirmation sound, isolating the group from the main airport flow. Inside, the room was minimal, designed for compliance verification: a table, 2 chairs, a scanning station, and multiple monitors displaying security protocols and identity verification systems. Reed placed the folder on the table and opened it carefully, expecting standard corporate transfer paperwork or sensitive material that would justify suspicion. Instead, the first page displayed structured government authorization formatting, layered identifiers, and classification markings that required multi-level clearance to interpret fully. His eyes narrowed slightly. "This is not typical passenger documentation," he said. Olivia remained standing near the table, hands relaxed at her sides. "It is not passenger documentation at all," she replied. The junior officer moved closer to one of the monitors and initiated a deeper scan of Olivia's identification profile. The system paused longer than expected, processing through multiple secure databases. A faint indicator light shifted from neutral to amber, signaling elevated verification requirements. Reed noticed it immediately. "Run it again," he ordered. The officer complied, but the result remained unchanged. Olivia's gaze moved briefly to the monitor, then back to Reed. There was no urgency in her expression, only quiet awareness of what was unfolding. Reed exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance. "If this is some form of misrepresentation, it will escalate beyond this room," he said. Olivia responded calmly. "It will escalate regardless, because the system has already recognized what you have not yet reviewed completely." The room fell into a deeper silence, interrupted only by the soft processing sounds of the verification system. Reed stepped closer to the table, looking again at the folder, now less certain of his initial assessment. The structure of authority in the room had not changed yet, but something subtle had begun to shift, not in action, but in interpretation. And for the first time since the encounter began, Officer Daniel Reed considered the possibility that the situation in front of him was not a standard enforcement case, but something that operated above his current level of authority. Inside the secure verification room, the atmosphere had shifted from procedural control to something closer to cautious uncertainty. The monitors continued to run layered identity checks, each cycle taking longer than the last, as if the system itself was reevaluating its own assumptions. Officer Daniel Reed stood slightly forward of the others now, his posture still firm, but less absolute than before. The junior officer avoided eye contact, focusing entirely on the verification terminal as new security protocols continued to load. Olivia Carter remained still near the center of the room, her presence unchanged, calm in a way that did not invite attention, yet made avoidance impossible. Reed glanced at her again, then back at the screen. "We are experiencing a delay in clearance confirmation," he said, more to maintain control of the situation than to inform her. Olivia did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice remained steady. "It is not a delay. It is escalation through hierarchy validation." Reed frowned slightly at the phrasing. "That is not a standard system response," he replied. One of the monitors emitted a soft, alert tone, indicating an incoming secure transmission. The junior officer hesitated before opening it, then immediately straightened his posture. "Sir," he said quietly, "this is coming from Central Command authorization channels." Reed stepped closer as the screen populated with encrypted header information, followed by partial declassification markers that required higher-level clearance than his current authority. His expression tightened as he read the first line. The room became quieter, not because sound disappeared, but because attention condensed into a single focal point. Olivia's gaze shifted briefly toward the display, then back to Reed. There was no emotional reaction in her face, only confirmation that the process had reached its intended stage. Reed took a slow breath, scanning the authorization chain. The document referenced an immediate structural appointment update within the Airport Enforcement Command hierarchy, along with a directive that superseded all active secondary screening protocols related to the current subject. He stopped reading for a moment, then continued, slower this time. The junior officer spoke hesitantly. "Sir, the system is identifying her profile under restricted command classification access." Reed did not respond immediately. Instead, he rechecked the identification sequence manually, as if repetition could change the outcome. It did not. Olivia finally spoke again, her tone unchanged. "You are verifying identity through a system that has already updated its reference hierarchy," she said. Reed looked up at her, and for the first time since the encounter began, his certainty no longer held its original structure. The authority he had been operating under was still present, but it no longer felt exclusive. It felt conditional. The monitors confirmed the final verification step, and the room entered a state of procedural pause, awaiting acknowledgement from the commanding level. No one moved. The environment itself seemed to be holding its breath, not because of danger, but because of transition. And in that transition, Officer Daniel Reed understood that the situation he initiated at the airport gate was no longer contained within his authority to conclude. Inside the secure verification room, the atmosphere shifted again as the system completed another silent layer of authentication, and the monitors transitioned from amber warnings to deep authorization blue, signaling that the identity validation process had moved beyond standard airport security protocols and into centralized command verification. Officer Daniel Reed stood rigid near the terminal, his earlier confidence now replaced with controlled stillness, as if any unnecessary movement might misinterpret the situation further. The junior officer beside him kept his eyes locked on the screen, waiting for instruction that no longer seemed clear. Olivia Carter remained in the same position near the center of the room, calm and composed, her presence unchanged despite the increasing complexity unfolding across the system interface. A new alert appeared across all connected screens, not as a warning, but as a directive acknowledgement from a higher jurisdiction authority layer, indicating that the subject under review was now linked to active command restructuring within the airport enforcement network. Reed read the header slowly, then stopped for a brief moment before continuing, as the structure of the message began to override the assumptions he had operated under since the initial detention. "This is a command-level update," the junior officer said quietly, almost unwilling to break the silence that had formed. Reed did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for the manual override panel, then paused, realizing there was no procedural path available that superseded the current directive stream. Olivia finally shifted her gaze toward the screen, acknowledging the update without visible reaction. "The system has completed verification," she said calmly. Reed turned toward her. "This authorization is not standard airport jurisdiction," he said, his voice lower now, less certain. Olivia responded without urgency. "It is not airport jurisdiction. It is integrated command assignment protocol," she said. The room seemed to contract slightly with that clarification, not physically, but in the way attention narrowed and pressure increased within the confined space. Another transmission arrived, this time accompanied by a full clearance overlay, revealing that the identity profile being processed was linked to a newly assigned senior enforcement command position effective immediately across multiple airport security divisions. Reed took a step closer to the display, reading again, slower this time, as if repetition could restore familiar structure. The junior officer spoke again, more hesitant than before. "Sir, all active containment protocols are now under review suspension." The phrase hung in the air without resistance. Reed looked down at the folder on the table, then back at Olivia, and for the first time, his interpretation of the situation shifted from suspicion to reassessment. The authority he had exercised moments earlier no longer aligned with the system response unfolding in front of him. Olivia remained still, her expression unchanged, but her silence now carried a different weight, not of defiance, but of confirmation. The monitors completed their final synchronization cycle, and the room entered a procedural standstill state, indicating that all enforcement actions required higher-level acknowledgement before continuation. No one spoke. No one moved. The environment was no longer actively controlled by any single individual in the room. And in that quiet procedural suspension, Officer Daniel Reed understood that the authority structure he had enforced at the airport gate had already been replaced before he ever stepped into the room. The procedural standstill inside the secure verification room continued without interruption, but the silence now carried a different quality, no longer shaped by uncertainty alone, but by the recognition that the system itself had entered a higher state of authority verification that no single officer present could override. Officer Daniel Reed remained near the terminal interface, his posture rigid but increasingly constrained by the absence of actionable commands. The junior officer stepped slightly back from the console, hands hovering near the controls without engaging them, as if physical interaction itself required permission that had not yet been granted. Olivia Carter stood at the center of the room, unchanged, her composure steady and deliberate, her attention not on the officers, but on the system feedback loops that continued to cycle across the monitors. A soft notification tone sounded once, then again, signaling the arrival of a synchronized command confirmation packet from central authority routing channels, and every screen in the room shifted simultaneously to a unified interface, displaying clearance reconciliation status. Reed looked at the display and slowly exhaled, not in relief, but in recognition that the system was no longer operating within the procedural framework he had initiated at the airport gate. The header across the screen updated again, indicating that enforcement actions associated with the current subject were now pending formal command integration approval under newly assigned leadership structure. The junior officer broke the silence quietly, stating that all secondary screening protocols had been fully suspended pending executive directive validation. Reed did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied the information line by line, as if searching for a procedural exception that no longer existed within the system architecture. Olivia finally shifted her gaze toward the terminal, acknowledging the update without urgency, her voice calm when she spoke. "The process is now complete at your level," she said. Reed turned toward her slowly. "At my level," he repeated, as if testing the meaning of the phrase against the reality of his position. Olivia did not correct him. She simply maintained her focus on the system interface, where the final authorization layer had begun populating with structural command hierarchy adjustments affecting multiple enforcement divisions across the airport network. The room felt smaller not because of physical change, but because every participant had begun to understand the boundaries of their authority more clearly than before. The junior officer stepped closer to Reed, lowering his voice to report that the system was no longer awaiting input from their station. Reed nodded slightly, absorbing the implication that their role had transitioned from active control to observational acknowledgement. Olivia remained still, her presence steady, as the final confirmation sequence completed across all connected terminals, locking in the updated command structure and formally suspending any previous enforcement directives tied to the initial detention. No one spoke after that. The monitors displayed a final status indicator, steady and unblinking, signaling completion of the transition phase. The environment did not feel chaotic or disrupted. Instead, it felt reorganized, as if every element within the room had been quietly reassigned to a different place within a system larger than the one they had been operating under. And in that moment of absolute procedural clarity, Officer Daniel Reed understood that what had begun as a routine airport security action had already concluded in a hierarchy that no longer recognized his authority as the defining factor. The final procedural status indicator remained steady across every monitor inside the secure verification room, no longer shifting or recalculating. As if the system had reached a point of irreversible confirmation where all prior uncertainty had been resolved into a single unified command structure. The lighting in the room felt unchanged, yet the atmosphere had become distinctly different, carrying the weight of finality rather than transition. Officer Daniel Reed stood near the terminal interface without speaking, his hands no longer interacting with any controls, as every available system function had already been locked under higher-level authorization. The junior officer remained slightly behind him, posture rigid, eyes fixed on the display as if waiting for an instruction that would no longer arrive from their chain of command. Olivia Carter stood at the center of the room with the same calm presence she had maintained since the beginning of the encounter, but now the environment responded to her position differently, not physically but structurally, as every active interface confirmed alignment with updated command hierarchy protocols. A final system transmission arrived across all connected airport security channels, marking the completion of command integration and the formal recognition of newly assigned leadership authority within the enforcement network. Reed read the header slowly, then again, his expression no longer showing resistance or disbelief, but a controlled understanding that the structure he had operated within had already been replaced before the verification process had ever begun. The junior officer broke the silence softly, stating that all prior enforcement actions associated with the initial detention had been fully archived and suspended under executive directive confirmation. Reed did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Olivia with a steady gaze that now carried acknowledgement rather than control. Olivia finally spoke, her voice calm and precise. "The system does not reverse once alignment is completed," she said. Reed nodded slightly, absorbing the implication without challenge. The monitors displayed a final confirmation sequence, indicating that command authority had been fully reassigned across all relevant airport security divisions and that operational. Control for any related protocols now required acknowledgement from the updated leadership structure before any further action could proceed. The room remained silent, but it was no longer a silence of uncertainty or tension. It was a silence of completion, where every procedural path had already reached its conclusion and no alternative outcome remained active within the system architecture. Reed stepped back from the terminal slowly, not in retreat, but in recognition of closure. The junior officer followed his movement, also stepping away from the console, both now no longer participants in the decision-making process but observers of a finalized transition. Olivia remained at the center, her presence steady, as the environment around her reflected full procedural compliance with the updated command structure. The system logs displayed final status confirmation across all screens, marking the end of active verification and the establishment of permanent authority alignment. No further alerts appeared. No additional requests were generated. The airport enforcement network had fully synchronized under the new hierarchy, and all prior assumptions about control had been formally retired from active protocol. In that moment, Officer Daniel Reed understood completely that what had unfolded inside the verification room was not an escalation of a routine security incident, but a structural replacement of authority that had already been decided before he ever initiated the arrest at the gate. The secure verification room remained in a completed state, with every monitor locked into finalized authority alignment screens that no longer updated or recalculated, as if the entire system had transitioned from active processing into permanent confirmation mode. Officer Daniel Reed stood slightly away from the terminal now, his posture no longer shaped by control or decision-making, but by the recognition of closure within a structure that had moved beyond his jurisdiction. The junior officer remained near the back wall of the room, maintaining distance from the central console, his attention fixed on the final system status display that continued to show unified command. Integration across all airport enforcement channels. Olivia Carter remained at the center of the space, unchanged in demeanor, her calm presence now reflected across every operational interface as the system completed its last synchronization cycle. A soft confirmation tone sounded once through the room speakers, not as an alert, but as a procedural acknowledgement that all enforcement actions related to the initial incident had been fully resolved and archived under the updated command hierarchy. Reed looked at the display for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and controlled. "So it was never about the inspection," he said. Olivia turned her gaze slightly toward him. "It was never about suspicion either," she replied. The statement was not delivered as correction, but as clarification of structure that had existed outside their immediate perception. The junior officer shifted his stance slightly, confirming through the system log that all prior detention records had been sealed and reclassified under executive authority review. Reed nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a conclusion that required no further argument. The monitors displayed final status confirmation across all connected systems, indicating full operational transition to new leadership oversight and permanent suspension of any previous procedural escalation pathways related to the case. The room itself felt unchanged physically, yet the function of everything within it had been fundamentally reassigned, including the roles of those standing inside it. Olivia remained still, her presence no longer interpreted through suspicion or investigation, but through recognition of authority that had been validated across multiple system layers. Reed stepped back from the central area, not in defeat, but in understanding that the process he initiated at the airport gate had already been completed at a level he was not originally positioned to see. The junior officer followed his movement, also stepping away from active interface control, both now fully outside any remaining decision authority regarding the incident. The system displayed its final state across all screens, complete integration, 0 pending actions, and full command hierarchy alignment confirmed. No further alerts appeared. No further verification requests were generated. The enforcement network had stabilized under the updated structure, and the procedural window for interpretation had closed entirely. In that final silence, Officer Daniel Reed understood that the moment of arrest at the airport gate had never been the beginning of the event, but only the point at which a pre-existing authority transition had become visible to those who were not part of its origin. The airport enforcement system had fully stabilized into its final configuration, and the secure verification room no longer displayed any active alerts or transitional states. Only a steady unified confirmation interface indicating that all procedural authority had been permanently synchronized under the updated command structure. The lighting in the room remained cold and neutral, but the emotional weight of the space had shifted into something quieter, as if every participant now understood that the event had already concluded long before the final system confirmation appeared on the screens. Officer Daniel Reed stood near the edge of the room, no longer positioned as an active decision-maker, but as an observer of a process that had surpassed the boundaries of his operational authority. The junior officer remained behind him, maintaining respectful distance from the terminal stations, occasionally glancing at the unchanged system status display that confirmed full integration across all airport security divisions. Olivia Carter stood at the center of the room, composed and still, her presence now reflected in the system as a confirmed authority node within the updated enforcement hierarchy, no longer under review, no longer under question. A final administrative confirmation tone sounded through the room, signaling the completion of all internal record updates and the closure of the incident file at every operational level. Reed exhaled slowly, his posture easing slightly as the realization settled in that there would be no further procedural escalation, no additional verification steps, and no remaining ambiguity. Within the system response, he looked toward Olivia, and for the first time since the encounter began at the airport gate, his expression carried acknowledgement rather than resistance. "Everything that started outside this room ended before we understood it," he said quietly. Olivia turned her attention toward him, her expression steady and without emphasis. "Understanding was never part of the initial requirement," she replied. The junior officer confirmed once more through the system terminal that all enforcement actions had been fully archived, and that command authority had been permanently transferred under executive integration protocols. The display showed no pending tasks, no unresolved flags, and no active review processes. The system was complete. Reed stepped slightly away from the terminal area, no longer attempting to interpret or reassess the sequence of events, but instead accepting the finality of the structure that had been revealed through it. Olivia remained still for a moment longer, her presence calm within the completed system environment, before the room's operational interface began transitioning into standard monitoring mode, indicating a return to normal airport function under the new authority alignment. The tension that had defined the earlier stages of the encounter no longer existed, replaced by procedural clarity that required no further validation. The junior officer lowered his gaze from the screen, acknowledging silently that his role in the incident had concluded at the point of system confirmation. Reed finally spoke again, his voice steady but reflective. "We initiated a response based on what we believed was a standard violation," he said. Olivia responded without hesitation, and the system responded based on what it already recognized. There was no further argument after that, only understanding. The room remained quiet as the final system logs closed and archived themselves automatically, marking the incident as resolved across all enforcement networks. Reed gave a small nod, not as an officer issuing judgment, but as an individual acknowledging a structural outcome beyond personal authority. Olivia turned slightly toward the exit, her movement unhurried, as the system behind her confirmed permanent alignment with the updated command structure across all airport divisions. The door opened with a soft mechanical signal, and she stepped forward into the corridor beyond, where normal airport operations continued uninterrupted, unaware that a full internal restructuring had just concluded within the system that governed them. Behind her, Officer Daniel Reed remained in the room for a moment longer, looking at the final status display, understanding that what had occurred was not a reversal of an arrest, but a redefinition of authority itself within the space where it began. The final transition state of the airport enforcement system had fully settled into permanent operational stability, and the verification room that once held active uncertainty now displayed only neutral system status indicators confirming that all incident data had been archived, all enforcement actions had been resolved, and all command hierarchies had been updated across the entire airport network. Officer Daniel Reed remained inside the room for several moments after the final procedural confirmations had completed, his posture no longer tense but reflective, as he observed the last static display, confirming that no further actions were required from his level of authority. The junior officer stood quietly near the secondary console, hands lowered, no longer interacting with any controls, acknowledging through silence that their operational involvement in the incident had fully concluded. Olivia Carter had already moved beyond the room and into the adjacent airport corridor, where normal passenger flow continued uninterrupted, the environment outside showing no visible awareness of the internal restructuring that had just taken place. Inside the room, Reed finally turned away from the terminal screens, stepping back slowly as the weight of the entire sequence settled into understanding rather than uncertainty. The system no longer required interpretation, explanation, or verification, because every possible procedural outcome had already been resolved at a structural level above the authority he had once exercised. The junior officer broke the silence briefly, stating that all incident logs had been permanently sealed under Executive Integration Protocol, and that no further review actions would be generated unless initiated from the updated command hierarchy. Reed acknowledged this with a slight nod, no longer attempting to reframe or reassess the situation, only accepting the finality of the system's conclusion. He looked once more toward the door through which Olivia had exited, then back at the silent monitors that now displayed standard operational status for airport security systems returning to routine function under new administrative alignment. There was no sense of reversal, no sense of correction, only completion, as if the entire sequence from the initial arrest to this moment had been part of a structured process that had always been moving toward this specific outcome. Outside the room, the airport continued its normal rhythm, travelers moving through gates, announcements echoing across terminals, and security checkpoints operating without interruption, completely unaware that a full internal authority transition had been executed within the enforcement layer governing their environment. Olivia Carter walked through the corridor with steady pace, her presence blending into the flow of movement while still carrying the unchanged composure that had defined her from the beginning of the incident. No one around her reacted, because from their perspective, nothing visible had changed, yet within the system she had just passed through, every layer of enforcement authority had already been realigned. Behind her, the verification room doors remained closed, and inside, Officer Daniel Reed stood in silence for a final moment before turning away from the terminal entirely. There was no disciplinary consequence, no dramatic closure, only the quiet recognition that authority in the system he served was not fixed at the level he once believed it to be. As he stepped out of the room, the final status display on the monitor faded into standard operational mode, confirming full normalization of airport security functions under the updated command structure. The incident that began with suspicion at the airport gate had concluded not with confrontation, but with structural replacement, leaving behind only procedural clarity and the understanding that control within the system had already shifted long before anyone inside it realized the transition had begun.